Your fireplace is probably lying to you. The one in your living room, the one you feed wood into every winter hoping to feel something. It is almost certainly sucking more warm air out of your home than it is putting back in. Traditional open fireplaces operate at roughly 10% efficiency, and some perform even worse than that, actually pulling heated air from your room and sending it straight up the chimney. But here is what they never told you. In 1796, a man designed a fireplace so radically different that the people who saw it for the first time called it a fool's design. They assumed it was broken. They assumed whoever built it didn't know what they were doing. It looked too shallow to work. It looked like a mistake. And then that same mistake heated every room it was placed in better than any fireplace that had come before it, and most that have come since. His name was Benjamin Thompson. He was born in Woburn, Massachusetts in 1753, and by the time he sat down to solve the fireplace problem, he had already been a school teacher, a spy for the British Crown during the American Revolution, a military officer in Bavaria, and a scientist who had overturned the dominant theory of heat itself. The man contained multitudes. By the 1790s, he had been granted the title Count Rumford by the Elector of Bavaria, named after the New Hampshire town where his career had started. And he had turned his formidable analytical mind towards something that seemed almost embarrassingly ordinary. Why were fireplaces so terrible at heating rooms? Walk into a colonial-era home with one of those old-fashioned wide, deep fireboxes, and you would see men and women huddled almost directly in front of the fire, and their faces scorched and their backs freezing. The fire roared, the wood burned, and most of that heat went straight up the flue into the open sky because the design of the fireplace hadn't been seriously engineered. It had just been copied, generation after generation, with nobody stopping to ask whether it actually worked. Rooms were cold, fireplaces smoked, people wore their coats indoors, and everyone assumed that was simply the nature of fire. Count Rumford did not assume anything. He measured, he documented, he redesigned. And when the first of his new fireplaces was installed, shallow, tall, with angled sidewalls that looked almost laughably sparse, the people who saw it called it a fool's design. The fireplace was barely a foot deep. Surely no real fire could live in that. Surely it would smoke the room out. Surely the man had made a catastrophic error. What they discovered instead was that the room got warm, genuinely, evenly, radiantly warm. And the question that stops you in your tracks is this one. If this design was so clearly superior, why have you never heard of it? Before we go any further, have you ever fed a fireplace for hours and still felt cold? Have you ever stood close enough to feel the burn on your skin while the far corner of the room stayed freezing? Drop that in the comments, because what you're about to discover is going to change how you see every fireplace you've ever stood in front of. Here's where things get uncomfortable. The modern fireplace, the kind you'll find in 9 out of 10 homes built in the last 100 years, is essentially a decorative object. Walk up to it and look at the firebox. It's deep, often 16 to 20 inches deep, sometimes more. The back wall is nearly vertical. The opening is wide and generous looking, because that's what builders and buyers came to expect. It looks impressive, it looks substantial. It looks like a serious piece of heating equipment, and it is almost completely ineffective. That deep firebox puts the fire far from the room. The heat radiates in every direction, including backward into the masonry and upward into the flue. The wide throat, the narrow passage connecting the firebox to the chimney, creates a powerful draft that doesn't just pull combustion gases up and out. It pulls room air, your warm room air, the air your furnace worked all day to heat. It drags that air across the top of the fire and up into the atmosphere. Studies of traditional fireplace design have found that a standard open fireplace can reduce a room's heat by actually depressurizing the space around it, meaning it pulls in cold outside air through window gaps and door cracks to replace what it's stealing from you. You are burning wood to get colder, Contrast that with what Rumford built. His firebox was no more than 12 inches deep, in some designs just 10. The side walls were angled sharply outward toward the room, sometimes at an angle of more than 45 degrees. The back wall tilted forward slightly. The throat above the fire was narrow, sometimes just 4 inches across, and rounded, shaped to accelerate airflow without creating the chaotic turbulence that sends smoke billowing back into the room. And there was a horizontal smoke shelf behind the throat, a ledge that caught and redirected the cold downdrafts that would otherwise interrupt the fire and drive smoke forward. Every single dimension was calculated. Nothing was arbitrary. This was an engineered system, not a craft tradition, and it worked. Here is the part that should make you quietly furious. The transition away from efficient fireplace design wasn't an accident. It wasn't ignorance. The Rumford design was published, celebrated, widely installed, and praised by Thomas Jefferson, who had 8 of them put into Monticello. The design was well understood, the physics were clear, and then, over the course of the 19th century, it was gradually edged out of practice, not because something better replaced it, but because something cheaper and faster became available. And the people who built homes stopped being asked whether their fireplaces heated rooms efficiently because fireplaces stopped being the primary heat source. Central heating arrived, steam radiators arrived, forced air furnaces arrived, and the fireplace became something else entirely, a mood object, a background feature, a selling point on a listing. Nobody needed it to actually work. So building codes were written around what looked right, not what worked. Proportions were standardized based on convention rather than thermodynamics. The deep box, the wide throat, the vertical back wall, all of it was codified as correct. And the Rumford proportions, the shallow box, the angled walls, the narrow throat, were in some jurisdictions literally prohibited as non-standard and potentially unsafe. Let that land for a second. The most efficient open fireplace design in history was banned in favor of the least efficient one because the industry had standardized around the wrong template. You didn't fail to heat your home. The design failed you. You were handed broken equipment and told it was the best available. Let's go deeper into exactly why the Rumford worked, because the mechanism is the story. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a fireplace the same way again. The first principle is radiation, and this is where most people's mental model of fire completely falls apart. We tend to think of a fireplace as something that heats air, that the hot air rising from the fire carries warmth into the room, but radiant heat is the real engine. Radiant heat travels in straight lines, like light, from a hot surface to anything it can reach directly. It doesn't heat the air between the fire and your body. It passes straight through that air and heats whatever it strikes. You, the floor, the walls, the furniture. Think of standing in winter sunlight. The air around you might be 30 degrees, but your face feels the warmth because the radiation from the sun reaches you directly. That is radiant heat. And that is what a properly designed fireplace should be delivering to the room. A deep firebox defeats this entirely. The fire sits far from the room. The side walls are roughly parallel, meaning much of the fire's radiant output goes sideways into brick, rather than outward into the living space. The back wall is upright, so the fire radiates into it rather than toward you. It's like building a campfire inside a box and expecting to get warm from the box's exterior. The heat is trapped in geometry. Rumford's angled sidewalls changed everything. When you splay those walls outward at a steep angle, they become reflectors. The radiant energy that would have struck a parallel sidewall dead on now strikes an angled surface and bounces out toward the room, toward the people, toward the floor and furniture. The firebox becomes something between a furnace and a spotlight. The heat that would have been absorbed by masonry is instead directed exactly where it's needed. This is the same basic principle engineers use when designing parabolic reflectors for satellite dishes and stage lighting. Geometry doing the work that extra fuel would otherwise have to do. The second principle is throat design, and this one is where the physics becomes almost beautiful in its simplicity. Every fireplace needs a throat. the constriction between the firebox and the chimney flue, because the draft that pulls smoke up and out is created by the pressure differential between hot gases rising in the flue and cooler air at the base. But most fireplace throats are far too wide. A wide throat creates an enormous draft, which sounds like a good thing. It pulls the smoke away efficiently. The problem is that it pulls everything else away efficiently too. Room air, heat. While everything gets sucked through that wide gap and sent up the stack. You are venting your home. Rumford's narrow, rounded throat, he refined the proportions through documented trial and error across dozens of installations, created exactly enough draft to carry smoke out without creating an atmospheric vacuum in the room. The shape of the throat mattered as much as the size. A sharp-edged opening creates turbulence. A rounded curve creates laminar flow, where the smoke travels as a smooth, organized stream rather than a chaotic boil. Think of the difference between a kinked garden hose and a smooth one. Same pressure, very different result. The Rumford throat let the fire breathe without letting the room bleed. The third principle is the smoke shelf, and this one solved the problem that had plagued fireplaces for centuries before Rumford came along. The problem of smoking. On windy days, or when a cold downdraft descended the chimney, the pressure reversal would drive smoke forward into the room. The smoke shelf is a horizontal ledge positioned directly behind the throat at the base of the flue. When a cold downdraft comes down the chimney, it strikes the smoke shelf and is directed back into the rising column of hot gases, where it gets caught up in the draft and pulled back up and out. The cold downdraft and the rising smoke share the same narrow throat, passing each other in opposite directions without conflict, the hot gases rising on one side, the cold air deflecting back up on the other. It's an elegant solution to a problem everyone had simply accepted as unavoidable. Cold day, smoky room. Rumford said no, that's an engineering problem, and here is its engineering solution. The impact was immediate and documented. Count Rumford himself reported retrofitting hundreds of London fireplaces with his design in the 1790s. And by his own account, every one of them was transformed. Contemporaries described the results as remarkable. Rooms that had been chronically cold and smoky became warm and clear-aired. Thomas Jefferson, who installed 8 Rumford fireplaces at Monticello between 1796 and 1809, was systematic enough in his own thinking to recognize a superior design when he encountered one. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge mentioned Rumford fireplaces in correspondence. By the early 1800s, Rumford's name had become synonymous with the word fireplace itself in certain parts of England. The design achieved what no amount of additional firewood ever could. It made the heat that was already being generated actually reach the people who needed it. So why did we abandon what worked? The answer runs through 3 separate forces, and together they form a pattern you'll recognize because you've seen it in other industries too. The first force was speed. The Rumford fireplace required precise dimensional ratios. The width, height, depth, throat size, and smoke shelf dimensions all had to be calculated relative to each other. A skilled mason who understood the design could build one correctly, but it required expertise, attention, and time that a production builder in the mid-19th century didn't want to spend. A deep box fireplace with a vertical back wall required no calculation. Any bricklayer could throw it up without measuring twice. As home building industrialized, precision became a cost center, and cost centers get eliminated. The second force was economics. Coal replaced wood as the dominant fuel across much of the United States and Britain in the second half of the 1800s. Coal burns differently from wood. It generates more heat per unit of volume. It requires different airflow management, and the closed iron stove handles it more efficiently than any open fireplace. The shift to coal made the open hearth less central to heating strategy, and once it was no longer the primary heat source, optimizing its performance stopped mattering. If the fireplace is decorative, efficiency is irrelevant. The third force was central heating. Steam radiators arrived in urban buildings in the mid-1800s. Forced air furnaces became standard residential equipment by the mid-20th century. And here is the hidden cost of that transition that nobody ever adds to the ledger. We traded a distributed, local, resilient heating technology for a centralized, fuel-dependent, infrastructure-reliant system. The Rumford fireplace needed a tree and a match. The modern forced air system needs a gas line, a blower motor, a heat exchanger, ductwork, a thermostat, a grid connection to power the blower, and a service contract. Every single one of those dependencies is a failure point. Every single one of them costs money on a recurring basis. The old system had none of them. We called the transition progress. The utility companies called it revenue. Now, here's what you can actually do with this information. Because knowing the history matters less than knowing how to apply it. The easiest option is to find out whether you already have a Rumford fireplace and don't know it. If your home was built before roughly 1850, particularly in New England, Virginia, or Pennsylvania, there is a real possibility that your fireplace was built to Rumford proportions. Measure the depth of the firebox. If it's 11 to 14 inches deep, look at the side walls. If they angle sharply outward toward the opening, you may have one. Do not let anyone upgrade it into a standard deep box design. That would be like converting a precision instrument into a decoration, which is precisely what happened to most of them. The intermediate option is to have a Rumford fireplace built or retrofitted. Rumford proportions are not mysterious. They were published in detail by Count Rumford himself and have been reconstructed and documented by contemporary fireplace engineers and masons. The key dimensions are a firebox depth of approximately 1/3 the height of the opening, sidewalls splayed at around 60 degrees from the back wall, a back wall that tilts slightly forward at the top, and a throat of roughly 4 inches with a rounded curve and a smoke shelf behind it. A skilled mason who has worked with Rumford designs can build this from scratch or modify an existing firebox. Search specifically for masons who list Rumford fireplaces in their portfolio. They exist, they're worth finding. The minimum option, the thing you can do this week with no construction involved, is to add a properly sized cast iron fireback to your existing fireplace. A fireback is a heavy iron plate that stands against the back wall of the firebox. It absorbs radiant heat from the fire and re-radiates it forward into the room, partially compensating for the directional inefficiency of a deep box design. It won't turn your fireplace into a Rumford, but it will meaningfully redirect heat that is currently going sideways into masonry and send more of it toward you. Firebacks are historically accurate. They were common in European homes from the 16th century onward, and they're available from fireplace specialty suppliers in sizes to fit most standard fireboxes. Count Rumford was not a folk hero or a frontier poet. He was a spy, an aristocrat, a scientist, and an engineer, and he understood fire better than the entire construction industry of his era, and arguably better than most of the century that followed him. He looked at something everyone accepted as fixed and asked a question no one else was asking. Why does this actually work so poorly? And then he fixed it. The knowledge wasn't lost. It was standardized out of existence. We're digging up the heating wisdom, the building methods, the food traditions, and the engineering logic that the modern industrial world quietly decided it didn't need anymore. And finding, over and over again, that those who came before us were not primitive. They were precise. Subscribe if you want to be part of that excavation. And tell us in the comments, what forgotten technology, old craft, or discarded method do you want us to investigate next? We're just getting started.